Welcome to the Bioethics Babe podcast, where we examine the tough questions in human flourishing in light of science, faith, and culture. I'm your host, Darina Grosso-Agnew. Now let's dive in. What if one of the most defining shifts in modern feminism didn't begin in the 1960s, but decades earlier? Before the sexual revolution, before the pill became mainstream, one woman helped upend how society viewed sex, motherhood, and the role of women themselves. Margaret Sanger didn't just advocate for birth control, she helped reframe it as essential to freedom, autonomy, and progress. But what vision of womanhood was behind that movement? And what happened to feminism once fertility became something to control, rather than something to receive? Today, I'm joined by Dr. Angela Franks, an award-winning author, a theologian at the Catholic University of America, and a mother of 6. She's the author of Margaret Sanger's Eugenic legacy, The Control of Female Fertility. Her latest book is Body and Identity, A History of the Empty Self. She joins me today to explore how birth control didn't just change women's lives. It may have reshaped feminism itself. Angela, welcome to Bioethics Babe.
Thanks for having me.
Angela, how did you first become interested in Margaret Sanger and the birth control movement?
It was actually my involvement with the pro-life movement. I was working at a pro-life organization and things were sort of slow one summer, and somebody had tried to send in a letter to the editor on Margaret Sanger, and the editor had rejected it, saying, well, these quotes are fabricated, and the evidence that he had was the Planned Parenthood website, which said the quotes were fabricated. And so I was just asked, explore this. Like, what, can we come up with maybe, a handout or something about this question? And I got really interested in it. My training is philosophy and theology, and so history was a little bit outside of the scope of that, but poking around in manuscript collections, going to archives, and doing the detective work of trying to find letters and ideas, and it just was a little bit intoxicating. And so the handout grew to an article, which grew to 3 articles, and then I was like, all right, it just has to be a book. And so that's how the book came about.
Mm-hmm. And when you began researching Sanger, what surprised you most, especially compared to how she's typically presented today?
I had known it was a narrative within the pro-life movement that Sanger was a eugenicist. And I remember in my high school American AP class, which used a college textbook, there was a 2-page spread that was basically canonization of Sanger and how important, how we rely upon her for women to, be free. And end of story, and I knew that mainstream narrative was wrong. I did not realize the complexity of the eugenics movement. Most people, when they think about eugenics, they think rightly about Nazi Germany, because that's our historical example of eugenics really successfully penetrating a society and its laws and its practices. And so we tend to think immediately of Nazi Germany, but the Nazis are particular kinds of eugenicists. And what I learned is that you not only had Nazi geneticists on, say, like the far right, but you also had communist and anarchist eugenicists on, say, the far left, and you had a lot of people in between. And so Sanger, it became really clear to me, was one of those more left-wing eugenicists, but still really committed to eugenic principles.
Mm-hmm. And for listeners who may only vaguely recognize her name, who was Margaret Sanger? What shaped her worldview? And what was she trying to accomplish?
Margaret Sanger is known to us because she founded what is now called the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. So she started America's first birth control clinic in 1916, and Planned Parenthood calls itself the largest reproductive rights organization because it goes back to 1916. It didn't actually get the name Planned Parenthood until several decades later, but she established this organization that, unlike what other eugenicists were doing, which was, giving academic papers and establishing the American Eugenics Society or whatever. Sanger established this organization that has now spread so that we have multiple affiliates across the US. We have international Planned Parenthood with affiliates across the world. So Sanger was able to be influential in a way that her fellow eugenicists were really not.
Hmm. And what did the sexual culture and family life look like before Sanger? What problem did she believe she was solving, and what made her so influential?
Sanger was born in the end of the 19th century, in the 1880s. And so the family culture is what we would consider to be more traditional in the sense that you didn't have a lot of working mothers at that point, unless they were very poor and they're going to factories or something like that. And you also tended to have larger families, at least among the lower classes. Upper class families had actually basically through the earlier forms of birth control, but also through things like sexual abstinence and withdrawal and other sorts of ways of controlling fertility. The upper class had fairly small family sizes, but the lower classes didn't. And Sanger looked at this and said, well, this is why the lower classes have all of these problems. And so she makes fertility the cause not only of personal problems, which she certainly has a lot to say about, like for her, women can't be free unless their fertility is controlled, but also social problems. So especially the fertility of the lower classes for Sanger is the cause, because of population growth, it becomes the cause of war and famine and disease and all sorts of other things in her mind.
Mm, that's fascinating. What about her background in terms of her relationship with her mother? What was her young life like when she was a young girl? Can you tell us about her and maybe some of the influences that impacted her worldview?
Yeah, so her mother was Catholic. They were of Irish descent. Her father was a kind of anarchist, Marxist freethinker who had a hard time holding down a job. She basically adored her father. Her mother, she had a very complicated relationship with. Her mother had several pregnancies. Her mother died fairly young, and Margaret blamed the pregnancies for her mother's young death. She was really, so she was formed by her father to a large degree. She was always a bit of a rebel. And what was really decisive, she got married, her first marriage where she gets the last name Sangers. They went and lived in Greenwich Village and kind of experienced this bohemia. And she was certainly influenced by people like Emma Goldman and these sort of anarchist slash Marxist sexual revolutionaries, which was definitely a minority opinion at the time. And she published basically a kind of newsletter that got her in legal trouble. So she fled in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. She went to England. And in England, she was tutored by people called neo-Malthusians. So they believed Thomas Malthus, who said that population growth will always outstrip food production. And Malthus said we have to deal with this by being continent, by refraining from sexual activity. The neo-Malthusian said we need to deal with this through birth control. And so they tutored her in a kind of eugenic understanding of population control, for which like contraception was really important. So those became really important influences on her. When she was in England, she decided to focus on contraception, which she had coined, or with someone else had coined, the term birth control. So this idea of control was really important to her.
And you already mentioned that prior to Margaret Sanger, birth control, quote unquote, looked like abstinence or, the pull-out method. What other forms of birth control were available or around at that time, especially in the Victorian era, et cetera, that you are aware of?
Condoms have been around for a long time. They didn't work very well then as now. Like even now, condoms are some of the least, there's the most method error in condoms among many of the birth control methods. So condoms are around. You had essentially what we call barrier methods, and so the thing that Sanger promoted were cervical caps, which were a barrier method that would go over the cervix. They were a little bit hard to insert. She also was on, if I'm remembering correctly, she was on a diaphragm kick for a while, also hard to insert. And so you had barrier methods, which from a moral perspective are not different from any other kind of contraception. But from a medical perspective, at least you're not introducing synthetic hormones into your bodies. The hormonal contraceptive shift comes in the 50s and finally coming to the market in the 60s. Sanger was definitely a major factor behind the development of hormonal contraception. She really found the money for the research to happen. And the reason is that she was aware that the barrier methods either did not work very well or they were a little bit hard to use. Like when, if you could use them effectively, they might be, if you use them properly, they'd be pretty effective. But she wanted to find contraceptives that the poor could use because that was always her eugenic concern. How do you limit the reproduction of the poor? And so the idea of taking a pill every day that you could hide from your partner, you could take it at any time of the day. You don't have to insert something right before intercourse or so forth. So that was a huge reason for her to promote hormonal contraceptives. But that takes a while for that science to develop.
Hmm. And how did her position on birth control and then in general birth control, how does the Catholic Church think about contraceptives in general?
She was well aware, as pretty much everybody was, that the Catholic Church was opposed to contraceptives. It's interesting when she gives classifications of groups she thinks should not reproduce because it's not good for the gene pool. And so this is a basic idea of eugenics that only some people have superior genes and they can reproduce, but people with defective genes should not reproduce. Um, she always put Catholics in the category of people that should not reproduce. Really, her greatest bigotry was directed toward Catholics. And this is precisely because she and basically everybody knew that the Catholic Church was opposed to contraception. So the reason it's opposed is that contraception intrinsically makes the sexual act, which by its nature leads to children. When things go right, when bodies are healthy, when everything's working the way your system is designed to work, then a child results. And so this is the natural end of the sexual act when things are functioning in a healthy way. Sanger wanted to disrupt the nature of the act itself. And that was the thing that the Catholic Church said you just can't do. A lot of people think, partly because we call things like natural family planning natural, which the church has said is acceptable to use natural family planning. A lot of people think, and Sanger thought too sometimes, that what the church didn't like is that birth control was artificial. And so there's one account of her arguing, she's testifying in front of some committee, and there's a Catholic bishop there who's going to testify. And she's like, well, look at Your Excellency over there with his glasses, and that's artificial, and he uses glasses to help him see. So why shouldn't we use birth control to control our reproduction? And it totally misses the point that it's not the artificiality per se that's the problem. It's what the artificial things do that's the problem, or they deliberately sterilize the sexual act.
Right. And of course, with the natural family planning, for those who are not familiar with natural family planning, what exactly is involved with that?
Natural family planning was actually developing around the same time people were researching hormones to develop the birth control pill. And the reason is that it wasn't until roughly 100 years ago that scientists had a deeper knowledge of what was happening in, for example, ovulation. So when the woman releases an egg, there's this whole hormonal support that actually works through the month to enable the woman to release the egg. And then if she does not conceive, to slough off the lining of the uterus, which has thickened in preparation for receiving a baby. So it's this complicated hormonal dance in women in particular that we just didn't understand very well. And what we know now is that when a woman is fertile, which for most women, now you have to speak in generalities here, but for most women, the fertile period, people usually say, is between 5 and 7 days a month. And then you want to build a little bit of buffer on either end of that because sperm can stay alive in the woman's body for longer. But basically, for that 5 to 7 day period, there are signs in the woman's body that her hormones are shifting. So a lot of people associate NFP with the rhythm method, which was just basically a calendar method that says, okay, let's assume everybody has a regular 28-day schedule, which is a huge assumption. But let's assume that. And if so, then here are the weeks you should abstain. So basically just track it after you get your period, and these are the times you should abstain. Now, in fact, the rhythm method can be as effective as condoms. So like it gets grief, but it's actually not terrible as far as a way of like understanding your fertility. But NFP is a lot better because you're not predicting when you're going to be infertile. You wake up and you look at your temperature and or you look at like what's happening inside your body. Are you producing a fluid that you produce when you get fertile? You just look at these signs and you say, am I fertile today? And so it's using the signs of the woman's body to determine if she's fertile right now.
Right. And we actually did an episode on fertility awareness with Dr. Marguerite Duane. So if you're interested in delving into this topic more specifically, I encourage you to listen to that episode. But
Yeah, she
obviously,
knows a lot more than I do
no, you
about
did
this kind of
great.
thing. That's why I'm deliberately speaking in generalities because, the science of it might have changed. But Dr. Duane is a great source.
You did great. And also the idea behind fertility awareness is to decide whether if you and your spouse want to get pregnant, you know exactly the time in the month when that is possible. And if you're avoiding for a very grave reason, serious reason, then you also abstain during those times, as you mentioned. So that's the way that Catholic understanding of using fertility awareness to either achieve pregnancy or avoid it in grave circumstances, it comes in. But going back to our topic of Margaret Sanger and just her context and environment, you mentioned that eugenics was a big movement in the early 20th century. Could you talk about the eugenics movement in general and also how Margaret Sanger's work intersected with these broader intellectual movements that were happening during that time?
Yeah, the eugenics movement is usually dated to Francis Galton in the end of the 19th century, but it really picks up steam in the late 19 teens and especially in the 1920s. It's an international phenomenon, so it's not only in America, although the American eugenics movement in many ways, it created, for example, model legislation around, for example, eugenic sterilization that the Nazis then basically picked up and put into place in Nazi Germany. I'm not aware that the model eugenic sterilization laws were actually passed anywhere in the US exactly as they're written, but they were more or less passed in Nazi Germany. So it's a worldwide phenomenon, but the Americans are pretty influential within it. And it included academics, so professors, scientists, university professors, and presidents of all kinds. So some people were involved in biology, some were demographers, which was a fairly new science at the time. There were sociologists, there were psychologists, and then there were activists like Sanger. And the activists were always looked down on by the mainstream eugenic scientists because they're like, we're doing science here, you know, and like Mrs. Sanger is off there giving speeches and rabble rousing. But the irony is that she succeeds, in fact, where they fail in a lot of ways. The basic conviction of eugenics that goes back to the neo-Malthusians is more children from the fit, fewer children from the unfit. And so obviously these terms fit and unfit are very loaded and in fact very subjective. But essentially it's whoever the eugenicists thought had good genes were the fit, those whom they thought should not reproduce because they had bad genes were the unfit. And you could be so-called unfit because your IQ was deemed too low. IQ tests were fairly new. They started around World War I, and they were very culturally conditioned. Like you might basically fail an IQ test just because you weren't born in America and you didn't understand the terms. But those were being wielded as like this idea, like, so the unfit could be intellectually defective, they could be prone to disease or disability, or they could be prone to mental illness. And those were the categories that most eugenicists agreed upon, with the addition of the poor, who often basically the eugenicists believe that if you are poor, you are also probably going to be unintelligent, probably sick, you know, so that they just assumed that there was going to be something else in those other categories that made you also unfit. So the eugenicists either were encouraging the fit to have more children, which Sanger wasn't really into because she didn't really think anybody should have more children, or this negative eugenics encouraged the unfit to have no children or few children. And that's where Sanger was really doing her activism with contraception and then with Planned Parenthood, later on with abortion, that these were means that would keep down the population of the unfit.
Yeah, and of course, there was a lot of money that was put into this type of research, as you mentioned, at universities, etc. And if you can talk a little bit about the fact that there were these quote unquote fitter family contests, what was it like in broader culture? This eugenic idea was deeply embedded in general culture. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, people don't really understand how people really think of it as a fringe Nazi thing, and they don't realize that in the 1920s and 1930s, you would find this everywhere in America. We had a majority of states had a eugenic sterilization law on the books, which stated that somebody who was quote unquote unfit, she could be sterilized. It was mostly women. She could be sterilized without her consent. And often this would happen in institutions where the women didn't even know that they were sterilized. They were told, oh, you need your appendix out or something. And they would sterilize her while she was under. So that was actually legal. So you had eugenic sterilization being promoted. You had these fitter family contests, which is kind of the side of positive eugenics, where they would, you know, at county fairs and stuff, there'd be a competition about, you know, who's the fittest family in our county or whatever. You had people giving money. You had people like writing letters to Harvard and Yale alumni, encouraging them to marry other alumni and have lots of kids and that sort of thing. That stuff is a little hokey, and you know, we kind of roll our eyes at it, but the negative eugenic side was a lot more coercive and oppressive, like with the forced sterilization. Eugenics was always an elitist movement. I mean, you basically have nobody who's like, yeah, I think I'm unfit. No, that's nobody involved in the eugenics movement is like, I'm here to prevent people like me from having kids. Like, it's always people who consider themselves elite and fit, who are concerned about the population of people who are not themselves and not like themselves. And so you had a lot of philanthropy, big name foundations. The Rockefellers were involved with eugenics in different formulations, including the Rockefeller Foundation gave money in the 1930s to some Nazi scientists who, at that point, people didn't know about, I mean, it hadn't even really happened yet that we had concentration camps and so forth, but it does indicate that there was a lot of comfort with what was happening in Nazi Germany on the eugenics front. Um, and then as the decades wear on, mostly after World War II, and when people learn about the full truth about the Holocaust, eugenics becomes discredited. And that's when the eugenics movement, really led by people like Sanger, switches into the population control movement. So population control becomes eugenics with a passport. And again, there's a huge amount of foundation support. Lots and lots of wealthy people are giving money to this to try to prevent people from, India. People are always obsessed with India, but also Japan and China and all of these places to try to keep them from having a lot of children.
Mhm. There was a Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell, in 1927 that involved eugenics and sterilization. Can you tell us about that case?
Yeah, that was an 8-1 decision. The person who did not sign on, he didn't write a brief. I'm forgetting my legal language. He didn't tell us why he didn't sign on. He was Catholic, so it's an interesting thought what might have been going on there. But basically, for the majority, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And so the idea was that Carrie Buck, who was in an institution, and we learn later, there was a documentary on PBS about this that might still be available somewhere online. We learn that she was, as happened to a lot of girls, was probably the victim of incest. And to deal with this situation, her family institutionalized her. She was almost certainly of average intelligence. Not that it matters, like you still shouldn't coercively sterilize people who are not, but it goes to show how the whole context was very discriminatory and very prone to jump to conclusions. And so the conclusions that the Supreme Court jumped to is that there is a right there's an interest on the part of governments to prevent these imbeciles from reproducing themselves. And so that was the test case was a state eugenic sterilization law. And so the decision opened up the floodgates to other states passing these laws. We don't know exactly how many people were sterilized because of the records being kept. Some of these laws are still on the books, actually, at least they were when I was writing my book. But the best estimates is that it's more than 60,000. So 60,000 people were probably sterilized between 1927 and roughly the 1960s when this isn't happening as frequently.
And California, right, was one of the states that had an ongoing sterilization program even till the 1990s, right? Or you may know the dates better.
Yeah, I can't remember precisely about California, but a situation that arose in the 1970s that garnered a lot of feminist opposition, which was good. There was a habit, and I would say a campaign. I don't know how official it was, but there was certainly this inclination on the part of doctors who were working for Medicaid when they would interact with poor women that they would pressure them into getting sterilized, or again, they would sterilize them without their knowledge while something else was happening. And so this especially targeted the poor. There were a lot of Black women who were targeted by this. But it was also happening within the federal Indian services, as they were called. The federal government promoted sterilization for Native American women. There's at least one tribe that was wiped out by this. Like literally, I mean, it was small to begin with, and all of the women who were of childbearing age had been sterilized by the Indian Health Services. And so it does continue after the 60s. It's now less explicitly eugenic in its in how people talk about it, but it's definitely eugenic in intent. and in result. Yeah.
Right. And even in the California prison systems, it was done without women's consent, without them even knowing that they were being sterilized. Now let's turn to feminism. You've argued that something fundamental shifted in how we understand womanhood. What was the pre Sanger view of women and motherhood that began to change?
So Sanger, when she, in like say the 19 aughts, begins to become an activist, she already had what she stepped into as a situation in which there had been an American, we would call it now feminist movement, going back, over 100 years, where you have women who were concerned with the lack of legal and social rights that women had. And so we usually call this first wave feminism. And the an obvious goal for first wave feminism, though it's more complicated than this, was suffrage, right? So the right for women to vote. But they're also concerned with education, with the ability of abused women to be able to safely leave their husbands and be able to take their children with them, the ability of women to own property. So there were a lot of different issues. Sanger determined that this kind of broad social legal focus was just too superficial. For Sanger, we only have social legal problems because the wrong people are having too many children. And so this is where her eugenic thought meets population control, where it's like, and this was very common rhetoric among population controllers, that it's a surplus of population that causes famine, war, disease, basically any social ill you can think of. Sanger said it's due to overpopulation of the unfit. And so the idea of saying, well, women can't get PhDs, so let's get together and advocate for schools to be able to, to grant women PhDs and so forth. Like for Sanger, that was just, like, why are you worrying about that? Like for her, the most fundamental thing was the need to control female fertility. And this is really revolutionary in a lot of ways, because women in the 19 aughts, 19 teens, 1920s did not instinctively think of their fertility as a per se problem. The way that women today instinctively will think, right? We're much more likely as women today to instinctively think, how do I manage my fertility in order to pursue the goals that I want to pursue? So, like, fertility is already posed as something problematic. That was not the obvious case. Now, obviously, pregnancy could be very dangerous. Childbirth, there's multiple reasons why women perceived that some kind of way of managing their fertility would be very helpful. But the idea that Sanger produced was social problems are due to female fertility. And the problems that feminists want to address are, in fact, caused by women themselves, by their healthy, fertile bodies. And this was a rhetorical and intellectual shift that was enormous, because the earlier feminists, for all of their virtues and faults, were generally concerned with how do we create a world in which women, with their capacity for motherhood, can exist more comfortably? Like, how do we change the world to fit women? And Sanger's approach was, how do we change women to fit the world? And so that was just it was just a Copernican shift within thinking about women.
Wow. So powerfully said. How did birth control begin to redefine the relationship between sex, marriage, and motherhood?
Yeah, so birth control says, like, once it becomes reliable in the way hormonal contraceptives became, birth control sells the idea that fertility is optional, that sex is not intrinsically ordered towards children. Now, that's obviously not the only thing sex does. Sex bonds the family. It's meant to express love. Like, I could go into the whole theology of it. But when you look at the basic meaning and structure of the act, it's the thing that's ordered towards children. And birth control says, no, that's not what the act is about. So now you have to say, well, what is the act about? Like, if it's not about children, and so now sex becomes something that basically is going to be self-defined by people, right? I'm going to decide what sex means for me. And obviously, as fallen human beings, we can define sex in pretty selfish ways, right? Where we're more concerned about ourselves and getting what we want than we are about our partner or our family or anything like that. And so birth control introduces, even for people who are well-intentioned and basically good people, it introduces this element into sexual relations where it's now becoming, sex is now what I want it to be. And that makes it, I argue, kind of structurally a more self-involved act than when you remember that sex is the act that's ordered towards children. And then when children come, so suppose like you're trying to avoid pregnancy, but you're not using contraception, you have a basic acceptance that this is the act that's ordered towards children. You get pregnant, you're like, well, that's really not what I wanted right now. But it's not the same sort of emotional shock than it is for somebody who's using birth control, where the agreement is, if I use this, we're not going to get pregnant. Now you get pregnant, and contraceptives fail both because of method error and user error. They fail all the time. Now you're like just not ready. You're not emotionally ready. You're like, this was not the agreement. Like, I didn't think this could happen. Even though if you push people, they'll be like, well, yeah, sure, I guess I know that sex causes babies. But like emotionally, you feel like, I didn't know that this was going to happen. And so it's one reason why when you introduce contraception to populations, we have a lot of evidence about this regarding with adolescents. When you give adolescents contraception, you actually get more unwanted pregnancies, because they've mentally absorbed the idea that I can engage in this act and not get pregnant. And adolescents notoriously don't use contraception very well. And so you get more unwanted pregnancies, which means often a higher contraceptive usage rate is linked to a higher abortion rate, because you have people who are just not psychologically prepared to receive a baby.
Yeah, that's a very important point. At a deeper level, what vision of the human person and of women specifically underlies Sanger's project?
Yeah, it's a vision where you don't naturally come into the world with dignity. And this is true of all eugenicists. Like, there's a sense in which, unlike the Judeo Christian vision, where all human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, with Sanger and with the eugenicists, there's kind of a return to this pagan vision that, like, you have dignity based on, like, how good you are, like what kind of person are you. A superior kind of person, then you have more dignity than somebody who's an inferior kind of person. And so that applies to everybody. Then with women, that's already applying, where in a sense you have to earn your dignity. You're not just conceived and born with your dignity. But she also argues that women have incurred a debt to society. That's her language in her book, Woman in the New Race, that because there has been so much anti-eugenic reproduction, in Sanger's view, that has created all of these social problems, women are now are like responsible for this, and they have to make up for this fault. They have to pay their debt by doing what Margaret Sanger wants them to do, by using birth control, by not having a lot of kids, and certainly if you're unfit, having, basically no children. And in that way, like, maybe she can kind of crawl back and pay her debt and be like a socially acceptable person. It's very much a view that makes demands on the human person. You have to do certain things and be a certain way in order to have dignity. I think it's the kind of it's a kind of vision of the person that's rampant these days. It's like a kind of social media appearance heavy social context really emphasizes like, well, you don't just start with dignity, like, do something extraordinary, be really witty, be really attractive, all of these sorts of things. Like, it's a similar sort of mindset. Like, there's a lot I have to do before I'm a person with dignity.
Hmm. And what happens to a culture when sex is separated from procreation?
Yeah, you kind of get our culture, right? So it becomes so Pope Paul VI in Humani Vitae, which was promulgated in 1968, which was sort of you know the center of historically of all of these revolutions happening. He makes several predictions that have pretty much come true. He predicts that you'll have eugenic population control by governments, which happened 100%. So China is the most obvious and the most horrific example, but by no means the only one, where you had the elite who were convinced by pretty much Western eugenic population controllers that, China will never become a modern, prosperous country unless you control your population, which is out of control right now. And so you had the one child policy. And now they're recognizing, oh, actually, this creates this like upside down population curve where you've got all of these old people and very few young people, comparatively speaking. And that's a huge social crisis. So you have governments who are using contraception or sterilization forcefully to force their populations not to reproduce. But on the interpersonal level, the impact, I think, is really deep and really significant, where it becomes very easy for men to walk away from pregnancies. And this has always biologically been the case, that men can walk away from a pregnancy. A woman literally cannot. A man literally can. But now this is exacerbated by contraception, because now the man, it used to be a woman could say, I'm not going to have sexual relations with you until you really commit to me, until we're married, because I can't, raise a child on my own. Like, I'm not, the stakes are too high for me. And so that sort of forced this kind of compromise between fallen human beings, where you've got a very strong male sex drive and a very strong self-protective sense on the part of women, and it worked to push people towards marriage. But now men can just say, "Well, I told you to get on the pill," or like, "I said I would pay for the abortion." Like, this isn't my problem, right? So it exacerbates the fatherlessness problem, where men can just simply leave. And it creates a situation of less real intimacy between people. It creates the possibility for people to use each other sexually much more easily, and it eats away at the commitment of sexual partners to each other, but then also to the children that result.
Exactly. And to your point earlier, we did an episode with Reggie Littlejohn on the situation in China, and exactly what you were talking about, and the limits it puts on people. How do you think that this view of motherhood and children reframed our understanding, not only of motherhood but of having children?
Yeah, having children becomes very optional. So instead of seeing it as like the normal way for most people who are called to marriage, that, we will express our love in creating a new generation, in raising that, like that's part of what it means to love another adult sexually and romantically, that it also becomes parental love. It doesn't just stay between the two parents. So that idea that motherhood is optional can easily be taken up by larger social structures, by businesses, by how people are managing the places of work and education and all of the structures that are so important to kind of our ordinary lives. So if the feminist movement is saying you might be married, but motherhood is really optional. You could see how a business would think, yeah, that's like a great message, right? Like I'll hire women, but like don't have expensive needs like pregnancy, childbirth, maternity leave. Like don't make me have to you're here from 9 to 5 or 8 to 7 or whatever the heck, and don't tell me that you've got like your kid's baseball game you want to go to, or that work life balance or whatever. So it becomes an excuse for structures that are already incentivized not to work with women's bodies and their life cycles. That's already kind of foreign to them. It just gives them actually a feminist rationale for not doing that even more. And so instead of that original vision that we need to change society to fit women, which includes their maternal abilities, now we're very much in the midst of changing women to fit society. So we'll modify your fertility so you can act just like a man who more or less is just like, has no cycles, no rhythms. You have to be like the man because you can get on hormonal birth control, et cetera. So yeah, it's definitely impacted us both at a personal and also a social.
Right. Like, for example, when companies don't really accommodate a nursing mom, right, at work, et cetera. So we have a lot of growth, areas of growth, to help women be the fullest version of themselves as women, not as trying to be a man, because that shouldn't be the direction we go in. Let's move from Sanger to the sexual revolution. Do you see a direct line from Sanger's ideas to the sexual revolution of the 1960s, and what connects them?
Absolutely. She was the most prominent free love advocate in America. Now, she generally tempered that side of herself when talking in public, but she was completely committed to, what we would call polyamory, free love, all of that was, stuff she was experimenting with at the turn into the 20th century. So she was definitely all on board with that. And birth control obviously makes that lifestyle much easier. Like it's one thing to say, I will have multiple sexual partners, but I'm going to have to stop doing that when I get pregnant. And another thing to say, sex is just about me, being sophisticated and having these affairs and doing this stuff. And I don't even have to think about children. So there's definitely in her thinking a direct line, but the real concrete causation there is that she is the one who dreamed up and got the funding for and promoted hormonal contraception, which is really the material thing that makes the sexual revolution possible, because it's just so much more effective than something like condoms. Now, also, though, because of the sexual revolution, we have all of a sudden an unwanted pregnancy revolution, precisely for the factors that I mentioned. If a woman is prior to the sexual revolution was inclined not to have sex because she's like, well, I don't want to get pregnant, and you have all these social mores supporting that decision, those mores break down. Now there's the pill. So you've got a lot of women who are having sexual relations who would not have been without the pill. So just by the sheer number of sexual acts being performed and given, the failure rates, you're going to get more unwanted pregnancy, which is why it's really contraception that makes abortion necessary, because now abortion has to be the backup for the contraceptive failure, because if you're encouraging people to have a lot of sex, you're going to just be having a lot more unwanted pregnancies.
So, how did the normalization of birth control reshape expectations around relationships, commitment, and family life?
Yeah, I think we know from looking at female preference studies that have been done for decades now that women are more likely than men to want sex within the context of a committed relationship and emotional vulnerability. And men, on the other hand, are more likely to want sex that's easy. And so all of that commitment and vulnerability, it takes time and effort. And so that's not easy sex, right? And so Mark Regner's talks about how women historically, at least before the sexual revolution, were the sexual gatekeepers because, being hormonally different, women had the ability to sort of step back from their sex drive and say, well, this might be really pleasurable, but I've got all of these consequences that'll come to me if I engage in this act. And I want to be bonded to my partner. I don't want to just feel like, a prostitute. So it's really interesting when you look at the statistics about sexual preferences. It's something like, and you'd have to look this up, but it's in the 20 percentiles, somewhere in the 20s, I think, of the number of men who say that having sex with a stranger sounds like a good idea. And the percentage of women who say that is like in the low single digits. It's just a different mindset. And now the irony is that when men do get married, they experience more social, emotional, financial, physical benefits than women do. They just don't know that they will. But so that's an interesting difference. So yeah, so contraception just removes the ability for women to easily be sexual gatekeepers, and it creates a narrative and what I've called the default of the yes, where you have to justify not doing the hookup or not, like you can't. It's the burden of explanation and justification is on somebody saying no. The yes is the default. It used to be that no was the default, right? And you had to convince somebody to say yes. And so contraception has shifted the default now to yes. And so you have to be very intentional, and so this is why a lot of women just don't date. They're just like, I'm just gonna do my career, and a lot of men are like, I can't find any women, so it's interesting how the sexual revolution has created this sex deficit in a lot of ways right now, just because the terrain out there is, with the violence from porn, people are just pulling back, and it makes people lonely and bitter. And so, yeah, it's an interesting place that we've gotten to now.
Mhm. Let's talk about the cultural legacy that Margaret Sanger has left behind. You were talking about her involvement in the development of the birth control pill. There have been critiques about this because there were trials that were conducted on poor and marginalized women in Puerto Rico. What is the historical record there, and how should we understand Sanger's role in that?
Yeah, the historical record is really pretty awful. And there's been a lot of research that's come out in the last 30 years where this has become recognized more at the mainstream level. At one point, I think it's in my book. I think it's the wealthy woman who was funding Catherine McCormick, who was funding the research on the pill. She's like, I just need to find a cage of ovulating females somewhere. And so they found cages of ovulating females in mental institutions, for example. So I used to live in Boston, there in Worcester, down the road, which is where the pill was mostly developed. There was a mental institution where they tested on women there. Absolutely not informed consent. They went to Puerto Rico because you could get away with more there. Generally, also not informed consent. And they also didn't listen to the women who would say, the side effects are really not acceptable, or, there were people were getting blood clots or having these serious health side effects, and those would get whitewashed. They would dismiss the women's reports of concern about side effects. The narrative was always like men Like if this interferes with men's sexual potency at all, or if they feel like it will, like we're just not even going to go there. We're not going to try to do it. And that was part of the kind of anti-female, pro-male bias of the birth control movement. So they were always focused on women, and it was really effectiveness was all they were looking for. They weren't really looking for something that was healthy or was comfortable to take. And so, yeah, this is reflected in the testing, which was really, really egregious in terms of like what we know now, how you should experiment with drugs. Like it just is like beyond the pale.
Did women die during these trials?
Yeah, there were deaths, both for the birth control pill, also for the IUD, which was developed 100% for population control. The idea was it's very cheap. It has to be inserted and removed by a doctor. And so a woman, once she has it in, she might not be able to get somebody to take it out. There were terrible cases of pelvic inflammatory disease and people losing their fertility with the IUD, and all of you have letters in for the Population Council archives where they're trying to figure out how to massage the pelvic inflammatory disease issues. And yeah, so there's deaths, there's injuries, there's loss of like permanent loss of fertility, and all of this is either covered up or presented in ways that aren't fully truthful.
And this is why we're shedding light on it today, so that people really understand the history of birth control and its development. Sanger founded what became Planned Parenthood, as you mentioned. How do you see her ideas reflected in the institution today, and how do you see them not being reflected?
Yeah, I always want to say I do not believe that Planned Parenthood clinics are like after hours sitting around huddled reading Mein Kampf or, quoting eugenics slogans or something like that. So I don't want to make it sound like, well, like there's some sort of secret conspiracy here of like diehard eugenicists. I just think Planned Parenthood is always already a eugenic organization. Like it's how Sanger founded it to be, and it attacks kind of people's weaknesses that are fundamentally, without knowing it, eugenic, right? So there's a lot of people who have no idea what eugenics is, who think that poor people shouldn't have kids, or certainly shouldn't have a lot. And that's just a fundamentally eugenic idea. It's like, well, we'll solve social problems by reducing or eliminating the people who suffer those problems. That's the eugenic idea. You see this a lot with abortion, economic arguments. It's like, well, we'll eliminate poverty by eliminating poor people, basically. And so Planned Parenthood has those biases just woven within the fabric of the institution. It's what she set it up to do. And so this is why they have way more clinics in poor neighborhoods than, in upper middle class neighborhoods. That's their target population is the people who are on the lower economic levels. Now, they've had to hide this fact, or so it used to be you could get statistics from Planned Parenthood on these sorts of things, and as it's come under more scrutiny, it just releases fewer statistics about the income levels, for example, or the races of the people that they serve. But yeah, I just think it's a eugenic organization in its purpose, and that's just not going to change.
Let's shift what will it take to reclaim authentic feminism. So, if feminism took a turn here, what would it mean to recover an authentic vision of feminism today?
Yes, that's a great question. So I think that the backdrop against which Sanger was fighting, so the people she didn't like, can sometimes provide a good guidance for what we need to do. In other words, are we trying to change society to fit women or change women to fit society? And so I definitely think the first approach is needed, and we actually need these kinds of changes don't happen without people coming together to advocate for them. You don't get businesses or governments mandating like parental leave after birth unless people demand it and say they want it. And so this is the space, I think, for, where we need activists. We need people to come together and demand change on things like how we accommodate motherhood, how we accommodate pregnancy, how we think about female vulnerability, which is so often tied up with the capacity to become a mother. And so I think we really need to refocus on that and not and reject the idea that women's healthy fertile bodies are the cause of their oppression. That you just can't get good solutions from that sort of erroneous and kind of horrifying way of posing the problem. And so we really have to reject that idea and refocus on the things that women actually need, which means accommodating their capacity for maternity rather than trying to obliterate it.
Right. And true feminism is to say, I have dignity as a woman, and for my fertility is a gift, right? And to reclaim that. For women today who feel caught between career, autonomy, and the desire for motherhood, what do you think they most need to see clearly?
So I think that when we understand autonomy or freedom as a matter of being free from commitments to others, as a matter of putting distance between us and somebody who needs care, I think that way of thinking about freedom and autonomy is fundamentally flawed. I think it's flawed for men as well as for women, but men can more easily get away with it because of being able to walk away from pregnancy. But for all of us, I think we need to recognize that freedom is a orientation towards what is really good. And we flourish as human beings by giving care and by receiving care when we are vulnerable. We're not just these isolated individuals, we're already within this web of family, and our loves create new webs that, connect us to each other. And the real satisfaction in life is not avoiding as many commitments of care to other people, but rather being accepting the ones that God wants to give us and really figuring out how does this work with the other things that God is calling me to do? For some, it's just going to be to focus full time on their kids. For others, it's going to be to try to figure out how motherhood fits in with a career. But you don't find the satisfaction in doing that by just saying, well, I'll only be happy if I'm really alone. It's not easy to care for people and accept those burdens, but it really is what we're made for that kind of self-gift, and it's where we find our ultimate satisfaction.
Thank you so much, Angela, for shedding light on this very important topic. Obviously, you have done so much research on Margaret Sanger and understand her role in the birth control movement and in the sexual revolution. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us.
Thank you.
For my conversation with Dr. Angela Franks, award-winning author, theologian at the Catholic University of America, mother of 6, and author of Margaret Sanger's Eugenic Legacy, The Control of Female Fertility, here are 5 key takeaways on Margaret Sanger and how the birth control movement rewired feminism and sparked the sexual revolution. 1. The real shift happened from changing society for women to changing women for society. Early feminism sought to reshape society to support women and motherhood. Margaret Sanger, on the other hand, introduced a fundamental shift, and her view was that the problem isn't society, the problem is women's fertility. This reframed women's bodies not as something to be supported, but something to be managed, limited, or controlled. 2. Birth control didn't solve a problem, it created more problems and redefined womanhood. Sanger reframed birth control as essential to female freedom. But birth control led to more unplanned pregnancies and abortion. Birth control also led to a deeper cultural change. Fertility became something to control, motherhood became optional, autonomy became central to identity, and feminism shifted from supporting women as mothers to liberating women from motherhood. 3. The birth control movement was deeply entwined with eugenics. Sanger's project wasn't just about individual freedom, it was shaped by a broader eugenic vision. More children from the quote unquote fit, fewer from the unfit. Poverty, illness, and social problems were attributed to one's healthy functioning fertility. The poor were often specifically targeted. This reveals a key tension. Controlling fertility was seen as a way to quote unquote solve social problems. 4. Separating sex from procreation reshaped culture and not just behavior. Once birth control made pregnancy seem optional, sex became self defined rather than inherently tied to children. Commitment weakened, relationships became more fragile, men could more easily disengage from responsibility. The default shifted from no to yes in sexual culture. This wasn't just a behavioral change, it altered the meaning of sex itself. 5. Reclaiming feminism means embracing the female body and healthy fertility. To recover an authentic feminism, we must recognize that women's bodies, including their fertility, are not the problem. Society should accommodate motherhood, not suppress it. True freedom is not avoidance of responsibility, but orientation toward what is good. True feminism is not about controlling healthy female fertility, but honoring and integrating it. It is about changing society for women and not changing women for society. Because truth matters and human dignity isn't optional. This is Bioethics Babe. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Bioethics Babe podcast. If you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and your favorite podcast platform, and share with your friends and family. Also check out bioethicsbabe.com for the latest episodes and resources.